Thank you for joining this presentation today, and I want to thank the organizers of the Parliament of World Religions for this opportunity. I hope that wherever you are in the world, that you're keeping safe during these pandemic times. I'm Reverend Dr. Brent Hawkes, and I have been an LGBT activist and was the senior pastor of the predominantly LGBTI Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto for over 40 years. And I recently founded Rainbow Faith and Freedom to combat religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia. During my time at MCC Toronto, I was at the forefront of ministry to the LGBTI community and helped thousands of LGBTI people and their families come back into a spiritual relationship with God. I have a long history of activism in Canada, including protesting the bath raids and the police activity, disrupting the legislature when they wouldn't pass legislation to give us protection in the Human Rights Code, participating in many demonstrations and speaking at demonstrations, and going on a hunger strike to protest police action. On January the 14th, 2001, I officiated at the first legal same-sex marriages, certainly in Canada and maybe in the history of the world. I also served the community at large, championing several human rights initiatives. I received 3 honorary degrees for my work on LGBTI human rights, and in 2007, I was appointed to the Order of Canada for my stand on social justice and human rights issues within the LGBTI communities. That's the highest award that Canada has bestowed on a gay activist. In 2011, I officiated over the state funeral for the Honourable Jack Layton, leader of Canada's official opposition party and head of the New Democratic Party. Jack touched the lives of millions of Canadians and was a vocal supporter of HIV/AIDS initiatives and LGBTI rights. And in 2015, I was appointed to the Order of New Brunswick for my leadership on LGBTI rights. I have constantly challenged the Church to examine important issues such as prejudice against gays and lesbians, inclusive language, as well as the ordination of women. I also played a significant role in promoting the inclusion of sexual orientation in the Ontario Human Rights Code and the Canadian Human Rights Act. The intersectionality between religion and sexuality and between religion and human rights is often full of conflict. Activists around the world say that the main opposition to LGBTI inclusion is religious-based discrimination, specifically religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia. In many countries, religious leaders have a significant impact and even control over political decisions. With the increase in religious fundamentalism in many parts of the world, the advancement of LGBTI human rights can no longer be taken for granted, and fighting religion may no longer be our main strategy. A religious attack requires a religious response. And whenever the religious right are able to frame an argument of God versus gays, we lose. So it's important to have religious people in the dialogue. Many of the social justice initiatives in various parts of the world have been led by religious leaders. While it's also true that much of the opposition has been religious-based, religious leaders like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, and Canadian Tommy Douglas have led the way. Often the language of opposition is most effectively challenged by faith language, speaking for inclusion. In the Canadian context, Tommy Douglas was a Baptist minister who fervently believed that his social justice activities were a result of his religious faith. This approach has been very effective in challenging the opposition. When forces of exclusion are able to monopolize faith spiritual language, they often remain the dominant influencer of public policy. However, when faith, religious voices in support of inclusion are prominent, there is a much greater chance of progressive forces winning the day. This reality should cause us to examine the appropriateness in every setting of empowering, supportive religious voices. In the struggle for equal marriage in Canada, a reporter mentioned to me that they had coincidentally done a public opinion poll of support for equal marriage shortly before we announced that we would be doing equal marriages. Approximately 2 months later, after the marriages were performed, they did the poll once again and said that it was the biggest shift in public opinion over a 2-month time frame on any social issue in the history of Canada. I believe this resulted not just because of the extensive discussion during these 2 months and not just because of the extensive media coverage, but also because it was centered on a religious leader and a faith community taking the initiative. This symbolism itself really caused people to rethink their faith-based opposition, once again showing that a religious attack requires a religious response. This workshop will focus on strategies that Rainbow Faith and Freedom is using to confront religious-based discrimination. While I was at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto, during that 40 years, most of the social justice activities that I participated in were reactive, responding to some situation or action of a public figure. And I always wanted to be able to be more proactive, to look at how do we change the culture rather than just reacting. How can we change the situation by changing hearts and minds? We've been on the defensive for too long. During my 40 years as a senior pastor, I was involved in not only building a faith community, but also in numerous LGBTI human rights causes. I decided to retire so I could devote more time to this current passion for LGBT human rights in Canada and around the world. In 2015, I took a 3-month sabbatical, and I visited over 10 LGBTI international organizations and allied organizations and numerous individuals in New York, Washington, and Geneva, including many of the larger international LGBT organizations. I looked at the state of LGBTI human rights internationally, especially related to religious-based discrimination against our community. I found that most international LGBTI groups are proudly secular and are not addressing religious-based LGBTI discrimination. I asked most of these organizations if they were proudly secular, and the response was almost always yes. And I followed up with a question about whether they were involved with LGBTI Christians or LGBTI Muslims or LGBTI Jews, for instance, in this struggle. And their answer was usually, no, they were not. I then outlined my plan to start an international organization to confront religious-based discrimination by changing hearts and minds. And I asked if they would work with me in this new organization, and I received overwhelming support. Often the individuals I met expressed that there was very little work in this area that was coordinated and that was adequately supported. Particularly, little attention was being given to best practices and whether something working in one part of the world would work in another part of the world. Also, when the LGBTI community views religion as the enemy, we're missing out on building religious support. With their positive feedback, I continued to work on the concept of this new organization. After retiring in 2018, I formed a steering committee which drafted vision, mission, 3 key pillars, manifesto, and values of the organization. The name Rainbow Faith and Freedom was chosen, and the organization was mandated to tackle religious-based LGBTI discrimination. I also made a few international trips in 2019, including a trip to Geneva sponsored by Global Affairs Canada, where I participated in a side panel at the UN Human Rights Commission and had a meeting and presentation with the Permanent Mission of Canada in Geneva, our embassy. The embassy staff were very supportive of the vision of Rainbow Faith and Freedom and indicated a willingness to be supportive. I also attended the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom in Washington, D.C., and on the same trip attended the Human Rights Campaign Forum Religious Liberty or Discrimination, co-hosted by the Human Rights Watch and the Human Rights Campaign. Through these interactions, it became very clear that the vision for Rainbow Faith and Freedom is timely. It has been overwhelmingly greeted with enthusiasm. It is often seen as a missing piece of the puzzle. The world needs the crucial contribution that Rainbow Faith and Freedom can bring. A few years ago, the Parliament of World Religions met here in Toronto, and there were 7,500 delegates in attendance from 120 of the world's religions. When we heard that it was coming to Toronto, Doug Kerr, a colleague of mine from the Dignity Network Canada, and I thought this would be the perfect time for us to gather folks from around the world to look at the issue of religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia, and also to have an impact on the Parliament of World Religions itself. We've been trying for the past few years to organize a conference on religious-based homophobia, and this seemed to be the perfect time. Never in the past had the Parliament of World Religions had any LGBTI content in their official program. So we approached the Parliament's head office in Chicago and expressed that it was time, since their theme for this Parliament was love and inclusion. It was time to include some LGBTI content. We received an enthusiastic response. They asked us to submit names for speakers and suggestions for workshops and panels. We got the word out to other LGBTI organizations, and as a result, the Parliament of World Religions accepted 19 workshop proposals with LGBTI supportive content to be included in the official program. They also contacted us to offer a free hospitality space for the whole conference. It became the Rainbow Lounge. It was decorated with large panels depicting LGBTI couples and some photos of members of the local LGBTI mosque. We opened the lounge with a special reception to a full room. It was an electric atmosphere as we made history with the first ever Parliament of World Religions LGBTI event. My husband John made 300 rainbow ribbons for people to wear, and they were all taken and worn in just a couple of days. On the Sunday of the Parliament of World Religions, a minister from the Unity Movement came to me and said that a young gay couple wanted to use the Rainbow Lounge to celebrate an engagement ceremony, and would that be okay? We responded that we'd certainly be honored to have it in the lounge. And on Monday, the ceremony occurred. It was very moving, and for the rest of the Parliament, this young gay couple walked around the conference site proudly holding hands. We closed our lounge on the final evening of the Parliament, and the room was packed. We recognized and celebrated the great beginning that the Parliament of World Religions represented, and we pledged to build on this foundation for an even better Parliament of World Religions in 3 years' time. Many folks signed up to help with that content. I can't state enough how excited it was to be part of this historic event, to meet spiritual activists from all over the world from many different faiths, and to see this potentially transformational entry into the religions of the world. At the closing ceremony of the Parliament, the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Parliament put on the screen for all 7,500 delegates to see the pictures from the engagement ceremony and said this was an example of the success of the Parliament and indicated his support for LGBTI inclusion. For many of us in the room, this was a clear signal that the time had come to seriously take a look at being more inclusive of LGBTI people. This was the first time that Rainbow Faith and Freedom had been a visible presence at a major international event. Our impact was a significant breakthrough and laid the groundwork for Rainbow Faith and Freedom to improve the lives of LGBTI people around the world by ensuring that religious-based discrimination against our community is addressed and diminished. Following the Parliament, we had a one-day symposium on November the 8th, 2018, and we heard from activists around the world regarding the impact of religious-based discrimination against the LGBTI community and what was working and what was not working to counteract this discrimination. A presentation was made outlining the vision and strategies for Rainbow Faith and Freedom, and significant time was devoted to hearing from the 25 attendees about what they liked about the vision and strategies and what changes they thought would make it better. This was extremely helpful input, and we left with many suggestions for improving how we would go about fulfilling our vision and strategies. The feedback was compiled and presented to the Steering Committee of Rainbow Faith and Freedom for discussion, and many of the recommendations were affirmed and included in our future planning. The symposium far exceeded what we'd hoped for. Attendees came from Canada, the US, Jamaica, Ivory Coast, Ethiopia, Eastern Europe, India, South Africa, Nigeria, Colombia, and the Philippines. Among the group were the first openly gay imam from North America, the first openly gay Orthodox rabbi, representatives from the United Church of Canada, metropolitan community churches, theology professors, activists, and more. Additional consultation meetings were held in 2019 focusing on two areas. The first was on what would be the values that would guide the work and the culture of Rainbow Faith and Freedom, both locally and internationally. This was an exciting process which led to the values which were unanimously embraced throughout the organization. The second focus of the consultation was how we would do our work both nationally and internationally in appropriate and effective ways. We brought together a dozen people who had experience in international work. Too often people in North America have good intentions, but get involved in international work in ways that are counterproductive and sometimes viewed as being imperialistic and supporting a colonial mentality. We wanted to take time before we launched any programs to really learn from those who are doing this international work in ways that we wanted to emulate. Once again, this consultation proved extremely valuable. Having clarified our vision at the original symposium and now how to work together appropriately, Rainbow Faith and Freedom is positioning itself to make a valuable and effective contribution to LGBTI safety and inclusion in Canada and around the world. This work we did on values came up with the following values. Number 1, results. We are results-oriented, effective, and we impact the world to achieve our vision. We have an impact on communities while fostering love and kindness among others. Next, learning. We want to be a learning organization, expanding our own hearts and minds and expanding learning through listening and engaging with others. Respect. We will have respect for others and different faiths and beliefs, respecting diverse experiences and perspectives. Through this respect, we will create safe places for people and organizations that we are to work with. Compassion. We are grounded in humility and acceptance and our deep connection to create empathy. This will create a culture of love, kindness, and belonging. Teamwork. We are a human-centered community which collaborates and creates partnership, friendship, and deep relationships. We support each other, respecting dissenting views, and work together to build community. We are committed to having an implementation plan led by our values team and getting feedback from inside and outside Rainbow Faith and Freedom to how we are living up to our values. Part of our strategy will be seeking feedback from people we work with on the ground. Our goal is that one day it would be clear that the culture and the people within Rainbow Faith and Freedom are really living out our values, and that people outside of the organization are truly impressed that the values of Rainbow Faith and Freedom are lived out and evident in all that we do. Homophobia and transphobia have impacted every institution in society throughout history. And while religion is not immune from this, it is reasonable to expect a higher standard for religion, because a central value of all the world's major religions is compassion. Religion can either be an obstacle or an asset at expanding human rights for LGBTI people. The most obvious is the degree to which religion is an obstacle to full inclusion. A religious attack requires a religious response, and the LGBTI community needs more training and strategizing around how to confront a religious attack. Also, seeing religion itself as the enemy has added difficulty to the lives of LGBTI people of faith. We are both attacked by the religious right and often ostracized within the LGBTI community because of our association to faith and religion. A key response to both of these situations is to empower LGBTI people of faith to be viewed as an important part of the struggle to achieve equality. As we effectively step up, the broader LGBTI human rights movement will trust us and will embrace us more. LGBTI people have historically had to choose between their spirituality and their sexuality, a choice no one should have to make. According to the Global Philanthropy Project, funding for spirituality is the most underfunded of the various strategies employed to achieve equality. Rainbow Faith and Freedom is uniquely positioned to address the above issues. We can be that voice counteracting the religious attack. We can empower LGBT people of faith to be more effective spokespersons. We can train LGBTI organizations on how to respond to the religious attacks. And we can participate in the longer-term strategy of building religious support and transforming religious opposition. Activists all over the world say that religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia are the main opposition to LGBTI inclusion and human rights. We need a new approach, and Rainbow Faith and Freedom represents that new approach. While it's certainly true that discrimination against LGBTI people has existed in every segment of society, for example, the legal, medical, and educational professions, political leadership, and faith communities, we make this point to emphasize that religion alone has not been part of the problem. However, all of the world's major religions share compassion as a major value, and it would be reasonable to say that religion could be held to a higher standard. We need to practice what we preach. In Canada, public opinion polls have shown us that historically there have been two groups opposed to LGBTI human rights, and therefore LGBTI inclusion. The first is people who say they don't know anyone who's gay or lesbian, and because they don't know anyone, they can believe the stereotypes and the lies. However, as people come out to their families and friends and co-workers, the percentage of people who say that they don't know anyone who's gay has gone down, and our support has gone up. This reinforces the importance and indeed the power of coming out, and it emphasizes the contribution that each brave individual has made in the advancement of human rights and inclusion. I once spoke to a group of grade 7 and 8 students and was asked by a young student, how can people say they don't know anyone who's gay? There's Will and Grace and Ellen. Will and Grace and Ellen are TV figures, TV shows. This indicates how important public figures are. The second group that has historically been opposed is people who say they are opposed for faith-based reasons. The challenge faced by the world's major religions is that they base their faith on sacred writings that were written thousands of years ago, when there was not the depth of understanding of sexual orientation, gender expression, or gender identity that we have today. Can you imagine if we based our legal or medical system on books written 2,000 years ago? Opposition to LGBTI human rights and inclusion in Canada is now predominantly left with faith-based folks. Research done by Outright Action International suggests that opposition to LGBTI inclusion in faith-based communities exists in almost every part of the world, although there are some regional variations, such as in Asia, where it is more due to family honor or culture than necessary religion or faith. Rather than fighting for legislative change, which is important, Rainbow Faith and Freedom will be focused on changing the hearts and minds of people of faith who are opposed to LGBTI human rights and inclusion because of faith-based teachings. The vision of Rainbow Faith and Freedom is to improve the lives of LGBTI people globally by confronting and decreasing religious-based LGBTI discrimination. Rainbow Faith and Freedom's mission is to inspire faith communities and families to be safe places for LGBTI people by changing hearts and minds of those individuals. You know, a healthy, successful tree is made up of roots, trunk, and branches. When the tree starts life as a seed, it first grows roots to anchor itself in the earth and provide the foundation for the trunk. And as the trunk grows, it in turn provides support for the branches and leaves that nourish the tree. The leaves in turn feed and sustain the rest of the tree. Together, all three of these parts work together to sustain the tree through a long and beautiful life. An organization goes through similar changes as it grows and develops. Since launching Rainbow Faith and Freedom 3 years ago, we have been focused on developing the roots of our tree to ensure that we lay a solid, sustainable foundation for our future growth. During this time, we have developed our governance structures, established our policies and procedures, developed a website, hired an administrative coordinator, appointed an executive director, and designed an organizational structure that will support a robust infrastructure to carry out our mission. Now we are ready to grow the trunk of our tree, which is the core operations of our organization. We've established a board of directors, several teams, including communications, IT, finance, fundraising, community outreach, and volunteer teams. We are also celebrating various milestones in the development of our core operations, including the following. We received not-for-profit status in 2019 and received charitable status in 2021. We launched our website in 2019. In 2019, I was appointed by the board as the executive director. We hired an administrative coordinator and a fundraising coordinator in 2020 and a manager of operations in 2021. We have hired several young people to be interns in the last couple of years through government funding. And thanks to a generous donor who resonated with the vision of Rainbow Faith and Freedom, we were able to hire an executive assistant in 2019. And in 2020, we celebrated our first full year budget. Now that we've pushed our roots deep into the earth and built a strong trunk, our next phase will be to focus on growing the branches of our tree. Those branches include 3 pillars for our work: our Canadian strategy, faith-based resources, and our global strategy. So for our Canadian pillar, Rainbow Faith and Freedom recently put out a report on mapping the landscape of faith-based heterosexist and transphobic discrimination in Canada. Canada houses some of the most progressive and expansive 2S LGBTQ+ protections in the world and is widely considered to be one of the safest places to express sexual or gender diversity. In fact, Canada has some of the lowest levels of homonegativity compared to other countries. Since the early to mid-1980s, Canadians could seek legal recourse for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Yet the lived experience of LGBTI Canadians, and especially those who are racialized and live in the intersection of multiple marginalized identities, show that the legal protections do not always mean equality in practice. Equality in law does not mean equality in practice. LGBTI Canadians, for instance, are more likely to be victims of sexual assault, to experience poor mental health and higher degrees of loneliness and social isolation, to suffer from substance use disorders, and to be economically marginalized. Rainbow Faith and Freedom aims to tackle one of the deep-seated justifications for institutionalized heterosexual and transphobia in Canada, that which is rooted in religion. Religiosity continues to be one of the strongest determinants of a person's view on homosexuality. While a largely secular society, Canada's institutions are built on a foundation of Christianized norms of heteronormativity and transphobia. These sectors include the family, worship communities, healthcare, and education. This report addresses the most crucial areas where faith-based discrimination operates, surveying research from the last 15 years, and documents the long-lasting impacts of this exclusion. Above all, it draws attention to the dearth of coordinated efforts to address the religious basis of which many LGBT rights are opposed, as well as the limited information about these systems available to community members. Healthcare providers, worship spaces, and schools in Canada either have a limited or non-existent platform which rates or identifies their policies and practices. These kinds of publicly navigable sites or databases are important to help LGBTI people maneuver systems that were often designed to exclude them. By comparison, the Human Rights Campaign has established indexes in the United States of municipalities, healthcare systems, and corporations. Metrics that determine the relative degree of safety or harm are crucial to understanding the problem and to provide actionable resources for community members. The role of religion in enforcing heteronormativity and the gender binary cannot be separated from histories of colonization, misogyny, and white supremacy in Canada. In fact, colonizers relied on their restrictive definitions of gender and sexuality to impose rule over Indigenous peoples, with a target on the crucial role of women and two-spirited persons and the role that they played in society. With this history at the forefront, confronting heterosexism and transphobia perpetuated by religion must take a decolonizing approach. This approach includes centering the experiences of two-spirited community members and recognizing the immense difference in the experience of settler LGBTI communities and two-spirit and queer Indigenous communities. Decolonization, as scholars Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang point out, is not a metaphor, but a practice of unsettling colonizer-colonized hierarchies. Nonprofits and others seeking to advance LGBTI inclusion, including Rainbow Faith and Freedom, must provide support to Indigenous-led organizations, including social and financial support, rather than seeking to do the work themselves. The desire to educate others, even in the interest of fighting homophobia, can often be rooted in a white savior complex and paternalism and must be rooted out of the nonprofit sector. The impacts of this discrimination are particularly prominent for those who are the most vulnerable in society, and for those who face barriers when seeking legal recourse from discrimination, including stateless people, newcomers, substance users, sex workers, the houseless, those living in poverty, among others. While the research included below shows that faith-based LGBTI discrimination is far-reaching and embedded within many crucial social institutions, there is no holistic research or study that investigates either the qualitative or quantitative evidence of how faith-based discrimination on the basis of sexual minority status operates today. The work required to combat faith-based homophobia and transphobia in Canada is immense. It requires those who undertake it to work in close collaboration with and in deference to the most marginalized, in particular, racialized and Indigenous communities. Further, this work has great potential for solidarities with other social justice movements. This report is by no means exhaustive and should be seen as an entry point into the various forces of faith-based discrimination. The author invites feedback and recognizes that there is always more to learn and more ways to grapple with these questions. You can access the full report on our website, rainbowfaithandfreedom.org. Now to our resource pillar. Our resource pillar offers multi-faith resources that will help individuals, organizations, institutions, and communities to learn to end religious-based LGBTI discrimination. In the fall of 2020, Rainbow Faith and Freedom conducted a successful project entitled Faith in Crisis that involved building an online portal containing progressive, multi-faith resources about being LGBTI and religious. These resources offer information about LGBTI-friendly religious organizations and resources that can help an individual reconcile their faith with their LGBT identity. The project then connected 100 LGBTI people and faith organizations to the portal and 500 people to each other during our launch week programming, which included 18 digital events that introduced the portal of over 200 plus resources, and new resources are being added every month. Here, Rainbow Faith and Freedom has created a centralized place where trustworthy, progressive resources exist and where we continue to connect individuals who may be struggling with COVID-19, their spirituality, and their LGBT identity with positive multi-faith resources and friendly online environments. To access and learn more about our resources, please visit rainbowfaithandfreedom.org/resource-portal. One of the options for Rainbow Faith and Freedom would have been to confront religious-based discrimination from a Christian perspective rather than a multi-faith perspective. We deliberately chose to be multi-faith because activists all over the world were pointing out that the main opposition to LGBTI inclusion and human rights was faith-based and went far beyond just the Christian faith alone. Many of the strategies to confront religious-based discrimination arising from one faith could also be used to confront discrimination from other faiths. The fact that all of the world's major religions rely on ancient spiritual documents, and when those documents are used in a legalistic or fundamentalist way, they negatively impact women, LGBTI people, and others. Approaching the issue of religious-based discrimination from a purely Christian perspective inhibits the interfaith learnings and the interfaith cooperation that benefits us all. Admittedly, at this stage, most of our work has gathered Christian-based resources, but we absolutely are committed to reaching out to other faith leaders to gather other resources as well. And finally, our international pillar. The international program is a 20-year strategic plan that involves partnering with organizations, institutions, and communities in selected countries to support their work to ensure that their communities are inclusive and affirming of LGBTI people. This program will engage activist organizations at home and abroad to achieve the goal of full inclusion using anti-colonial, anti-racist, and equitable strategies. This will result in a measurable decline in the rates of religious-based LGBTI discrimination. We are partnering with LGBTI organizations on the ground. We've also formed partnerships with the Global Interfaith Network for peoples of all sexes, sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions out of South Africa, and the Global Justice Institute out of New York. We became a member of the Commonwealth Equality Network and are continuing to develop relationships with the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association in Geneva, Outright Action International in New York, and we have been in partnership with the EGAL Human Rights Trust here in Canada since 2019. We also established, with the help of international partners, our criteria for establishing the countries we want to work with. And using those criteria, we have chosen 2 of our first 3 countries, Jamaica and Fiji. We will seek grants and donations to help fund this work. The strategies to change hearts and minds will develop with our partners on the ground and will be led by those partners on the ground. Ultimately, we will build an awareness of best practices and develop resources. We will also look at how we can support individuals and organizations doing this work outside of our partner countries. I approach this work knowing that I will be accused of being a white man thinking he can save the world, and that I might replicate missionary colonial approaches that have been so damaging. I do not see myself as a white savior taking on the forces of evil. I believe that there is a desire among North Americans, LGBTI folks, and our allies to support the work of LGBTI human rights internationally. And while we need to avoid being imperialistic, I believe we can mobilize resources in North America and elsewhere to support the work being done in other countries. It is crucially important that the strategies to be developed are developed and led by people on the ground who know their situation best. There may be times when something that has worked in one part of the world might be worthy of consideration in other parts of the world. But again, this decision will be made by people on the ground. The development of best practices can often lead to global North knows best. However, if we think of this instead of as best practices as effective strategies, then the local context would be developing their own best practices for that context. Through participating in various online conferences and webinars, Rainbow Faith and Freedom is gaining a profile around the world, and we are enthusiastically welcomed as an important part of the global effort. Volunteers are vital to keeping RFF moving forward. We are always looking for good volunteers with varying skill sets for our communications, community outreach, finance, fundraising, IT, multi-faith resources, Canadian programming, volunteer and values teams. If you would like to volunteer with Rainbow Faith and Freedom, please contact us at volunteer@rainbowfaithandfreedom.org. Our goal at Rainbow Faith and Freedom is to try to raise monthly pledges to achieve our vision. With monthly donations, we can better plan and budget for our various programs. This is an opportunity for LGBTI people in North America who are concerned about international LGBTI human rights to make a difference through financial support. It's also an opportunity for people in Canada to contribute if they want Canada to do better, and an opportunity for people of a certain faith tradition who want their faith to do better in Canada and other countries. We're also seeking government and foundation grants and targeting fundraising campaigns for one-off donations and pledges. We will be reaching out to the Canadian diaspora in the countries we will be working with to help us with fundraising. We'll also be seeking support from various faith communities in Canada, churches, synagogues, mosques, etc. Tax receipts will be provided in Canada and the U.S. For donations outside of North America, we're looking for partner organizations that can help us issue tax receipts. So we'd appreciate you considering making a monthly donation. It's clear that each of us brings many different aspects of who we are to each situation we encounter. Taking an intersectional approach recognizes this complexity and has more of an opportunity to develop effective strategies to counteract discrimination in all of its complexities. An intersectional approach also brings with it the probability that all of us, in all of our complexities, will have a better chance of overcoming discrimination and exclusion, rather than separating the various pieces of ourselves. Intersectionality also means that learnings from the feminist movement, the racial justice movement, the disability movement, etc., can be shared in other movements for human rights and inclusion. Rainbow Faith and Freedom is committed to modeling equity, diversity, and inclusion principles within our organization. One of the key ways to change hearts and minds is through education. Learning is one of the key values of our Rainbow Faith and Freedom. Rainbow Faith and Freedom will be developing learning opportunities through community outreach, seminars, panels, and developing educational materials to offer communities, faith leaders, and individuals the opportunity to learn. As we learn in collaboration with our local partners, the development of resources will be contextual to that situation and also have the potential to offer insight in other locations. In many progressive Christian circles, they often talk about the spiritual gospel and the social gospel being two sides of the same coin. Historically, this has meant that people of faith are challenged to not only lead deeply personal spiritual lives, but also to engage in actions to make the world a better place, a more just place, a more compassionate place for everyone. It means that our faith calls us to be engaged in activities that both care for people in need and change the systems that might lead to the inequality in the first place. With this dual approach in the lives of many of the prominent spiritual and social justice leaders, in Canada, this was profoundly seen in the life of Tommy Douglas, who was both a Baptist minister and also a leading politician. As Premier of the province of Saskatchewan, he introduced socialized medicine because he believed that the size of a person's bank account should not dictate the quality of their care. He did this because his faith called him to be concerned about the sick, and now all of Canada is better off because of our healthcare system. We also see this dual approach in the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was also a minister and prominent leader in the civil rights movement. Dr. King also spoke eloquently about how his faith caused him to fight for social justice and civil rights for any marginalized community. So today, as people of faith, we are called to be committed to spirituality and social justice. And together, as a faith-based organization, Rainbow Faith and Freedom is called to hear the cries of LGBT people all over the world who want to find faith communities where they can worship without discrimination and families where they can be loved without exception. At Rainbow Faith and Freedom, we believe that we are called to be a movement that directly confronts and reduces religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia. Religious-based homophobia and transphobia are major obstacles to the achievement of LGBTI equality. Rainbow Faith and Freedom is a movement to mobilize people of faith to ensure that families and faith communities are safer for LGBTI people in Canada and around the world. If religion has been a major problem, then it means that religious people of faith need to be a major part of the solution. Rainbow Faith and Freedom will mobilize that support. Spirituality and social justice coming together. In conclusion, there are brave individuals all over the world working in the intersectionality of religion and human rights. How can we help to coordinate and support their important work? Religion is not the enemy. Religious-based discrimination is. Dealing with it will not only help families and local faith communities to be safer places for LGBTI people, but will also help in the struggle for legislative changes. Religion got us into this mess. Now religion needs to help get us out of it. For more information on the work of Rainbow Faith and Freedom, please go to www.rainbowfaithandfreedom.org. Thank you for your time today, and I hope this presentation was insightful.